There is something specific about what the government told Salvatore Vitale in early 2003. They did not tell him that Joseph Massino was a criminal. He already knew that completely. They did not tell him that the organization was under pressure, or that other men had already begun to cooperate. He had been watching that from inside his own house, on federal supervision, for the better part of 2 years. He knew that Frank Coppa had gone to Quantico. He knew what that meant. He had been living inside the accelerating logic of the investigation for longer than most people understood. What they told him was something else, something that had nothing to do with the investigation's logic, something that could only be known by the person it had happened to, and that had been withheld from that person by every man who understood what it meant, until the government received it through Coppa and Cantarella and decided, at a moment it chose, to disclose it. They told him that the man who had taught him to swim, the man who had been the best man at his wedding, who had held his son at the baptismal font, who had been at his side since childhood, had concluded, privately and without telling him, that Vitale was already an enemy, and had given the order accordingly. Vitale received that information in federal custody. He was 55 years old. He had been a member of the Bonanno crime family for 30 years. He had participated, by his own subsequent admission, in 11 murders. He had maintained his loyalty through prison, through marginalization, through the slow and deliberate reduction of his role from underboss to figurehead. He had maintained it through the months of house arrest and federal supervision, through the extortion charges and the loan sharking charges and the RICO indictment that named him alongside the man he had protected for 3 decades. 7 weeks passed between the arrest and the cooperation agreement. That interval from January 9th to February 28th, 2003 is not well documented in the public record. What happened inside it is largely inferential, reconstructed from the testimony and accounts that came later, but the interval itself is significant. It was not a brief procedural interlude. It was 7 weeks in which Vitale was in federal custody, charged with racketeering and murder, separated from the man he had known for his entire adult life, in possession of what he knew about the organization, and in possession of what the government had just told him about what Massino had been prepared to do. 7 weeks of holding those two things simultaneously. The cooperation framework was available to him immediately. He had known that on the day of his arrest. He had made, according to accounts of the arraignment, a private decision to flip as soon as it was safe to do so. What the 7 weeks represented was the time required for safe to mean something specific for the government's disclosure to reach him, for the implications to settle into something he could act on, for the identity that had been organized around loyalty to become, through that disclosure, an identity organized around something else. There is no dramatic account of those 7 weeks, no conversion narrative, no moment of visible emotional crisis. Vitale was, by the accounts of people who knew him and observed him during this period, a man who processed things internally. He had spent 30 years in an environment where the public expression of internal states was a liability. The specific quality that the family's culture had trained him to perform: steadiness, control, the appearance of equanimity, regardless of what was happening underneath, did not abandon him under pressure. What changed in those 7 weeks was not visible from outside. It was the private dissolution of an organizing principle that had structured 30 years of decisions. On February 28, 2003, 7 weeks after his arrest, Salvatore Vitale formally agreed to cooperate with the federal government. He testified against Massino at trial. He spent more than 100 sessions debriefing federal investigators. He provided information that identified 500 mobsters and associates. He helped locate the remains of 3 murder victims who had been buried for years. He testified at 6 trials. He was the most significant witness in the most significant organized crime prosecution of his generation. He did all of this not because the government offered him a deal. He did it because of what they told him. Joseph Massino and Salvatore Vitale grew up 5 blocks from each other in Maspeth, Queens. Massino was 5 years older. He began dating Vitale's sister Josephine when he was 13. He married her in 1960. By then, the relationship between the two men was already something that had no clean name, not quite brothers. not exactly employer and employee, not simply friends who happened to share a criminal enterprise. It was something older and more layered than any of those categories. The relationship of two people who have been inside each other's lives so long that neither can fully reconstruct what came before the other was there. Massino taught Vitale to swim. He was the best man at Vitale's wedding. He served as godfather to one of Vitale's sons. When Vitale left his job as a corrections officer in the late 1960s after the military, after Long Island, after the attempt to build a different kind of life, he went to Massino. Not because there was nowhere else to go, because that was where he went. He became involved in burglaries, truck hijacking, the organizational infrastructure of the Bonanno family's street operations. He rose through Massino's sponsorship, with Massino's endorsement, under Massino's protection. When Massino went to prison in 1987, Vitale ran operations in his absence and waited. When Massino was released in 1992 on supervised release, he named Vitale Underboss, partly because the title gave Vitale standing, partly because Vitale, who had no prior mafia convictions, could serve as Massino's legal messenger while Massino was prohibited from associating with known felons. They worked within 30 feet of each other, most days, for 30 years. The geography of that proximity is worth understanding. In Maspeth, in those years, the kind of world Massino represented was not hidden. It was part of the neighborhood's texture. For a young man in that environment, a young man whose brother-in-law moved with a specific kind of authority, whose word meant something that no legal document could capture, the pull was structural, not exceptional. Vitale had attempted another life. He had graduated from high school when Massino had not. He had served in the military, trained as a paratrooper, worn a uniform. He had worked as a corrections officer in Queens. He and Diana had moved to Long Island deliberately, a distance from Maspeth and everything Maspeth represented. He had tried to be the person who did not follow the path that the neighborhood made available. That attempt lasted until it didn't. When he left the corrections job, he came back to Massino, not because the door was forced open, because it had never been fully closed. He took an oath that Massino had already spent years making real to him through proximity and example. By the mid-1970s, the distinction between the two men's lives had dissolved below the threshold of practical meaning. They ran operations together. They shared the specific knowledge that, once shared, creates a bond that is not primarily effective, but structural, the knowledge of what the other person has done, the knowledge that separates both of them permanently from the world that does not know. By 1981, they had crossed into territory from which there was no return. The Donnie Brasco operation had ended, and the family needed to respond to what it had cost them. The capo who had sponsored the undercover agent, Dominic Napolitano, had to be killed. It was understood that way, without extensive discussion, by the men who needed to understand it. According to Vitale's testimony at Massino's trial in 2004, Massino communicated the order using a specific formulation. He said, "I have to give him the receipt for the Donnie Brasco situation." Vitale was part of the planning. He was part of the execution. This is the specific texture of what the two men shared, not merely the ordinary proximity of family, not merely the professional alliance of criminal enterprise, the kind of intimacy that only comes from having been present at the same moments, from knowing the same things, from carrying the same exposure. What binds two people inside a closed system is not simply affection. It is the specific weight of shared culpability. The knowledge that separation, if it ever came, would be the most dangerous act either of them could perform. That architecture held for 20 years. Then it started to change. When Massino rebuilt the Bonanno family after his release from prison in 1992, he built it according to a specific principle: limit what any individual can know, and you limit what any defection can cost you. Crews were separated. Capos were forbidden from contacting one another directly. The social clubs were closed. The phones went dark. The organizational structure was redesigned from the ground up to ensure that the next Donnie Brasco or the next cooperating witness of any kind would find, upon cooperation, that what he knew was useful but not comprehensive. A portion of the picture, not the whole. It was intelligent architecture. and it had a side effect that Massino either did not notice or did not care about. It made the position of underboss meaningless. In a functioning Bonanno hierarchy, the underboss was the central transmission point of the organization, the link between the boss and the capos, the channel through which orders moved and tribute returned. The role carried real authority, real access, real income. Under the new architecture, those functions disappeared. Massino communicated directly with capos when he chose to, through channels that bypassed Vitale entirely. The organizational redesign that was meant to protect the family had the structural consequence of reducing the underboss to a title. Vitale testified about this at Massino's trial in 2004. He used a specific phrase. He said, "I had the title, but for lack of a better term, I was a figurehead." He was also, by the accounts of people who knew both men during this period, increasingly unwelcome. The family's capos regarded him as greedy, as overstepping whatever authority remained to him, as making claims on resources and respect that his actual position did not support. Massino communicated this to Vitale directly, that Vitale's unpopularity was a factor in the decisions being made about his role. Consider what that was. Communicated between these two specific men. After 30 years, it was not a performance review. It was not organizational feedback. It was one man telling another man, a man who had been in his life since childhood, whose sister he had married, whose son he had held at baptism, that the other people in the room did not like him, and that this was a problem Massino had decided to make Vitale's. There is a particular quality to being told that you are unwelcome in a place you have given 30 years to. Vitale had not merely worked inside the Bonanno family. He had organized his life around it. He had moved to Long Island to keep his children away from it, and then he had come back to it anyway, and then he had stayed. Through the trials and the prison terms and the supervised release and the hollow title, because the relationship at the center of the family was the relationship at the center of his life. To be told by that person that the room had grown tired of him, that his presence was a problem, that his claims on the organization's respect were larger than his actual position supported, was a specific kind of wound, not dramatic, not sudden, the kind that works slowly, that accumulates over the months and years in which a person continues to perform the loyalty that the relationship requires. While receiving less and less evidence that the loyalty is acknowledged, Vitale stayed. He participated in the March 1999 murder of Bonanno family capo Gerlando Sciascia, organized by Massino, carried out with Vitale's involvement, staged to look like a drug deal to obscure its organizational character. He helped manage the family's affairs. He maintained what the relationship required, even as what the relationship offered continued to contract. Leaving was not an option he recognized. The relationship, whatever it had become, was the organizing structure of his adult life. There was no version of exit that did not carry consequences he understood precisely, having been present for the imposition of those consequences on others. And Massino, privately, began to interpret the loyalty as suspicious. In 2001, Vitale pleaded guilty to his role in an extortion scheme on Long Island. In 2002, he pleaded guilty to loan sharking charges. He was placed under house arrest while awaiting sentencing on both matters. His legal exposure was serious, but it was, by the standards of what Massino and the family's senior leadership were facing, comparatively limited. The maximum sentence Vitale was likely to receive was substantially lower than what a comprehensive RICO conspiracy charge would produce. That limited exposure was, in the world of the Bonanno family in 2001 and 2002, an anomaly worth scrutinizing. Massino scrutinized it. The conclusion he reached, according to the testimony of Frank Coppa and Richard Canarella after their own cooperation with the government, was that Vitale's comparatively modest charges were not the product of good legal fortune. They were the product of a deal already made. Vitale, Massino concluded, was already cooperating. His limited exposure was the evidence. The conclusion was wrong. Vitale was not cooperating. He was under house arrest, awaiting sentencing, maintaining his loyalty, staying away from Massino in the months leading up to the arrest, according to a recorded conversation documented later, because Diana, Vitale's wife, had become frightened, not of the government, of Massino. She had sensed something. Massino, acting on his wrong conclusion, issued a private order. If he was arrested, Vitale was to be taken down. The phrase carried its functional ambiguity. It could mean demoted, could mean killed. In the organizational language of the Bonanno family, the recipients of the message understood what was meant without requiring clarification. Massino later testified, after his own cooperation with the government, that he had considered having Vitale killed but decided against it in order to spare his wife, Josephine Vitale's sister, the loss of her brother. The consideration, in his account, was for his wife, not for the man who had been at his side for 30 years, not for the man who was, at the moment the order was issued, sitting in his house under federal supervision, loyal, waiting, maintaining the silence that Massino had built his entire organization around the principle of maintaining. The order was issued. Vitale did not know about it. He went on maintaining the loyalty. He was still maintaining it when they arrested him on January 9th, 2003. The arrests came early in the morning at Massino's home in Howard Beach, Queens. The agents were Jeffrey Saleh and Kimberly McCaffrey, the same forensic accountants who had begun reviewing the family's financial documents in 1999 and whose patient, document-intensive work had produced the October 2002 RICO indictment. The indictment named both men, Massino and Vitale, along with Frank Lino and Daniel Mangelli. Massino was charged, among other counts, with ordering the 1981 murder of Dominic Napolitano. Vitale was charged with his participation in the same murder. They were arrested the same morning. They were arraigned together. At some point during the arraignment, according to accounts of the day, Vitale made a private decision. He decided to flip as soon as it was safe to do so. He made it because of something he already understood, something he had felt building for months in a way he could not fully articulate. Something in the way Diana had been frightened. Something in the distance he had been maintaining from a man he had known his entire adult life. He did not yet have the information that would confirm what he suspected. He was about to receive it. The government had been holding something. COPA had provided it at Quantico during the weeks he spent with federal investigators after his own cooperation in October 2002. Cantarella had provided corroborating detail. Both men had been present for conversations in which Massino's private order regarding Vitale had been communicated. Both men had described it. The government had documented it. And the government had been waiting for the right moment to use it. The moment was now. Federal prosecutors informed Vitale of what Massino had been prepared to do. They did not present it as leverage. They did not deliver it as a threat or a persuasion. They presented it as what it was, a disclosure. Part of the ongoing production of evidence in the case. This is what the investigation has produced. This is what you were not told. Vitale received it. The man who had taught him to swim. The man who had stood beside him at his wedding. Who had held his son. Who had been in his life since before he understood what his life would be. That man had concluded, based on a misreading of Vitale's legal exposure, based on a wrong assumption about why the government hadn't charged him with more that Vitale had already turned, and had been prepared to have him killed for it, on a misunderstanding, while Vitale was sitting in his house, under ankle monitor, loyal, staying away from Massino because his wife was frightened, waiting for the legal process to resolve itself so that he could return to the relationship he had been inside for 30 years. He had been loyal while Massino was already planning to remove him, protecting a relationship that the other party had already decided was over. There was nothing dramatic in what followed, at least not in the way that word is usually meant. No confrontation, no explosion, no moment that an observer in the room would have identified as a turning point. Vitale was 55 years old. He was not a man who had ever been given to visible emotion in institutional settings. 7 weeks after his arrest, on February 28, 2003, he formally agreed to cooperate with the federal government. To understand what that decision required, it is necessary to account for what Vitale was giving up, not in the legal sense, not in the instrumental sense of what the cooperation agreement offered, but in the more fundamental sense of what he had been. His entire adult identity had been organized around being the person who stayed, around being the man in the room who could be trusted. around the specific quality of loyalty that Massino had built the organization's culture to depend on the loyalty that was real, that was not merely calculative, that had persisted through everything the relationship had demanded. He had stayed when Massino went to prison. He had waited. He had managed the family's affairs in Massino's absence and returned control when Massino came back, without the kind of complication that power vacuums in criminal organizations typically produce. He had stayed when the family's capos turned cold toward him, when Massino told him, directly, that his unpopularity was a problem, when the underboss title became hollow and the access contracted and the role he had been performing for 30 years was reduced to ceremonial presence in a structure that had been deliberately redesigned to make him unnecessary. He had stayed through the extortion charges and the loan sharking charges and the house arrest and the federal supervision. He had stayed through Diana's fear and the distance he had kept from Massino in the months before the arrest, maintaining the loyalty from a remove that had its own implications. Diana's fear is worth naming specifically. According to a conversation documented in a recording made by James Tartaglione in January 2004, a recording that the government later introduced as evidence of the organizational climate inside the family. During this period, she had been frightened enough of Massino that Vitale had stayed away from him in the months before the arrest, not because Vitale had become frightened, because she had, and because he had listened to her enough to adjust his behavior accordingly. That detail is small. It sits at the edge of the official record, in a recorded conversation rather than in formal testimony, but it provides something that the formal record does not: a glimpse of what the relationship looked like from inside a household. Two people in their 50s, in federal legal jeopardy, keeping a cautious distance from the man at the center of both their lives because something in his behavior had produced fear in a woman who had been adjacent to that world for 30 years. Vitale understood what that fear meant. He had been present in organizational settings when other people's fear of Massino had produced justified outcomes. He understood the signal. He had been, by every available account, the person in the organization most committed to remaining what the organization required him to be. The other Bonanno defendants, watching from their own federal holds, had already begun calling him Fredo, the reference unmistakable to anyone who had seen The Godfather Part 2, the compromised brother, the one who breaks. The name was being applied before he had done anything to deserve it. It was a prediction. It was the family's way of acknowledging, before Vitale acknowledged it himself, that the relationship had already ended in the only way such relationships can end, when the people inside them have shared what these two men shared. The reference was precise. Fredo Corleone is not a traitor because he is evil. He is a traitor because his loyalty was never reciprocated in kind, because the man at the center of the family had long since privately concluded that Fredo was a vulnerability rather than an asset. The name was a prediction, a man loyal past the point where loyalty made sense, whose fidelity was, in the organizational reading, his most dangerous quality. When it broke, the rupture would be total. The FBI took the threat to Vitale's life seriously enough to house him and Massino in separate facilities, Massino in Brooklyn, Vitale in Manhattan, and to maintain their separation throughout the pretrial period. Massino, in custody, was making his intentions clear through the channels that remained available to him. He wanted to give him a receipt. The phrase was Massino's own, the same phrase he had used decades earlier for Napolitano, the same phrase that Vitale had helped him execute. Vitale knew what it meant. He had been present when the original receipt was given. He took the witness stand at Massino's trial on May 28, 2004. He was the last of the 6 cooperating MAID members to testify. By the time he took the stand, the prosecution had already presented Coppa, Cantarella, Lino, Tartaglione, and the others. The structure of the case had been established. The organizational charts had been presented. The recordings had been played. The jury had been sitting with this material for weeks. What Vitale provided was different from what the others had provided. He had been at the center for 30 years. Not at a capo's remove, not through organizational channels, but in the room, beside Massino, present for the decisions that the other cooperating witnesses could only describe from outside the circle. He could testify not only to what happened, but to the conversation in which it was decided, the context in which the order was given, the reasoning such as it was that Massino offered to the person he was most comfortable with when explaining what he intended to do. Vitale testified for multiple days. The defense cross-examined him on his motivation, on his credibility, on the 11 murders he had admitted to, and the sentencing benefit he would receive for his cooperation. Breitbart, Massino's attorney, was experienced and capable. But the cross-examination faced a structural problem that no amount of skill could fully resolve. Vitale's account was corroborated at every significant point by physical evidence, by recordings, by the accounts of other cooperating witnesses who had no coordination with him. 8 cooperating witnesses, each interviewed separately, each describing the same organizational decisions from different positions within the same hierarchy. The coherence was not the coherence of fabrication, it was the coherence of shared reality. Massino was convicted on all counts on July 30th, 2004. He learned of the verdict from Vitale. In effect, since Vitale had described the decisions that produced each charge. What happened in the period between Vitale's formal cooperation in February 2003 and that conviction is the documented story of a cascade. Frank Lino formalized his cooperation in April 2003. James Tartaglione had anticipated his own indictment and agreed to wear a wire while he remained free, producing recordings that captured, among other things, conversations about the deteriorating atmosphere inside the family. Other made members followed, each calculation shaped in part by the awareness that Vitale had already delivered everything that mattered about the leadership tier of the organization. The cell structure that Massino had built had worked against the family's rank and file. The compartmentalization had limited the damage that any individual defection from the lower tiers could produce, but it had not limited, could not have limited the damage produced by the person who had been outside the cell structure entirely. The person too close to the boss, too long, for any organizational architecture to address. Vitale testified at 6 trials in total. His cooperation identified more than 500 mobsters and associates across the United States. It helped locate the remains of 3 murder victims missing for years. It contributed to more than 80 convictions. The government's 2010 sentencing documents characterized his cooperation as a complete operational history of the family's leadership decisions, delivered by the person who had been present for all of them. He was sentenced to time served. He entered the Witness Protection Program. There is a specific irony in the mechanism through which the Bonanno family's silence ultimately broke. Massino had built the organization's security architecture to address a specific category of threat, the threat posed by people whose loyalty was contingent, by people who might calculate, under sufficient pressure, that cooperation served their interests better than silence. He had built against that contingency with precision and intelligence, and it had held for 20 years. The Brasco operation had identified the vulnerability of social clubs. He closed them. The financial prosecutions that had dismantled other bosses had identified the vulnerability of conspicuous wealth. He controlled it. The informant cultivations that had broken other families had identified the vulnerability of members who knew too much about operations outside their own. He built the cell structure. He had studied the specific mechanisms of failure in other organizations and designed against each of them. What he had not designed against was the contingency created by the person whose loyalty was not contingent, the person who had stayed through everything, the person whose commitment to the relationship was the most genuine, most sustained, and most costly thing in his adult life. He had not needed to design against that. That loyalty was supposed to be absolute. It was absolute, until the moment Vitale learned that it was not mutual. The order had been issued at a moment when Vitale was doing exactly what the organization's culture required. Maintaining the silence, absorbing the marginalization, keeping the distance that Diana's fear had made necessary, doing what 30 years of loyalty had trained him to do. The order was issued about a man who was, at that precise moment, loyal. The specific mechanism that ended 30 years of unconditional loyalty was not legal pressure. It was not the calculation of sentences and cooperation agreements. It was the disclosure of a private order issued in error, at a moment when the person it concerned was sitting in his house, under federal supervision, maintaining the loyalty, keeping the silence, waiting for the relationship to return to what it had been. Massino had assumed the worst of the person who had given him the most. He had been wrong, and the wrongness of that assumption, when Vitale finally learned of it, converted 30 years of genuine loyalty into the instrument of Massino's conviction, not the loyalty of a man who calculated. The loyalty of a man who had believed, until a federal prosecutor told him otherwise, that the person at the center of his life understood what he had been, and had valued it accordingly. He had been wrong about that in a way that no amount of preparation could have fully guarded against, because you cannot prepare for the discovery that the loyalty you gave was not seen as loyalty, that it was seen, by the person who received it, as a form of threat. Vitale entered the Witness Protection Program in 2010. He had testified at 6 trials. He had given the government information that produced more than 80 convictions. He had sat, under oath, across a courtroom from the man at the center of his life, and described 30 years of decisions they had made together. The last of those descriptions was the one Massino could not survive, not because Vitale was a better witness than the others, because he had been there for everything. And he had stayed there, loyal, past the point where staying should have been possible, past the marginalization and the hollow title, and Diana's fear, and the distance he had kept in the months before the arrest, until the only thing left that could move him was the discovery that he had been loyal to a man who had already decided he was an enemy. The organization that had called itself Unbreakable had broken, not because of the forensic accountants, though they had made it possible, not because of Frank Copa's arithmetic, though that had made it visible, not because of the cascade of defections that followed, though each one had made the next easier. It had broken because of a private order, issued in error, about the one man in the organization whose loyalty had never been in question. Joseph Massino had built 20 years of institutional silence on the specific claim that his organization was different, that the men inside it were made of something the others were not. Salvatore Vitale was the proof of that claim. He was also, in the end, the instrument of its refutation.